And there was somebody who came a few weeks ago and she went in the dark for 2 hours and she was like, no fucking way, I can't be in there, like super freaked out. And so we really invited her to customize it. Like, what if you just wove in and out? There's no right way to do it. The more that you make it your own, one of the invitations here is to let nurture lead. What would nurture do? And so this invitation of like, what would nurture? It's not about enduring. You're not going to get any bonus points for finishing this. I mean, maybe on some level and some cognitive level, but there's nothing that's going to happen in your body that has you drop into a deeper connection because you did it. And so she wove in and out of the dark, and she had some more one-on-one time with Adrian, and we had deeper, longer talks while I was up there. And she did that for 4 days. And on the 5th day that she was here, the final day, she was in the dark, and I went up that evening and she was like, Scott, I love being in my body. I'm so happy in the dark. And that was somebody who went in for 2 hours and like ran out screaming and was like, I can't handle it. And she was like, there's still these waves, but they don't overwhelm me now. Like, I can be with the sense of overwhelm in my body. I can be with that now. Her capacity to be with, her sense of like safety in her body grew in those 4 or 5 days.
Welcome to season 3 of The Reframe, where fear is brave. We are experiencing right now a time of human evolution where consciousness is dramatically evolving. The world is shifting, old paradigms are crumbling, and we are dreamscaping a new humanity. Join me as we explore this rapidly unfolding experience, unwinding outdated beliefs through shadow work, learning to tap into the wisdom of your own higher consciousness, bringing ancient wisdom practices into modern times, and remembering what it means to breathe sacred living back into your daily life. Today, we are going to hear from Scott Berman, founder of Sky Cave Retreats, the first darkness retreat center in the U.S. Throughout the last decade, he has spent over 2 years in self-guided solo retreats in remote wilderness. He did his first darkness retreat in 2012 and has spent over 70 days in multiple solo darkness retreats, including a couple with his wife, Jill. Over the last 4 years, he has supported over 500 people in their dark retreats and has been pioneering the darkness retreat movement at his center in Southern Oregon. In this episode, you'll learn about the history of darkness retreats and its evolution to what it is today, how going into the dark can look vastly different from one person to another, and what he suggests you do to prepare for and integrate after a dark retreat. There is so much to go over today, so without further ado, let's dive in. Scott, it is an absolute pleasure to have you join The Reframe, where fear is brave. And I've really been looking forward to being able to take the time and sit down with you around darkness retreats, what that looks like, where it's come from, and how that really impacts people's lives.
Yeah. Thanks for having me here, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we could start with, I mean, what is a darkness retreat, and maybe just touch on kind of the ancient history of it, as it seems like, and within the context of our culture, it's definitely unusual, extreme, maybe abnormal, but then take the context of our culture in the context of being like a human animal on this planet, and our culture is pretty strange and abnormal. And so touching on the history maybe reframes it in a different light. So just at the base level, a darkness retreat is where someone goes into total darkness. Ours are also mostly soundproof, which is not an element of all dark retreats. They're all different in space, in the support, in kind of how they're held. Typically here, people go into the dark for 3 or 4 days. It's been an evolution. We've been hosting dark retreats here for about 4.5 years. We've had close to 500 people come through here over the years. So there's been a real learning curve and an evolution of how we support, how we hold, how we orient. And that's really changed a lot over the years and also substantially, significantly when Adrian, who's my other teammate partner here, who does somatic based sessions before someone goes in and when they go out on the other side of the dark immersion. And she brought a lot of different elements to how we orient here that's really changed and evolved. And we're constantly learning from each person that comes through because everyone's so different in the way that they respond and react in the dark and the way that they're structured and conditioned. Like there's so much. So it is a real fluid, evolving, and refining process of being with people here. And so typically people go in for 3 to 4 days. In the earlier days, people were going in for, it was just open-ended. We weren't sure what we were doing. I wasn't sure what I was doing. Adrian joined about 2.5 years ago. And so things really changed at that point. But in the beginning, it was more for me based on how I had always done it, which was just going in. There was really no support. I would go in for 10 days. I started doing darkness retreat in 2012. I had spent a lot of time in solitude before doing my first dark retreat. And then once we started hosting dark retreats here in 2020, people were going in 6 days, 8 days, 10 days. And what we've come to see over the years is that longer is not deeper, almost never directly related to deeper, and actually tends to lend itself towards a less deep experience, which is kind of counter as like one may think. But what tends to happen is that, I'm jumping all over the place, but maybe we'll touch a bunch of different things and then kind of reel it in. What tends to happen when somebody initially goes into the dark is there is a period where there's a big melatonin dump. And for many people, there's a period of sleeping and like relaxation, and they're really comfortable. That can last for some people, that might last for 10 minutes. Some people, it's the first night and part of the next day. But after that initial wave kind of subsides, darkness is initially a stressor. It initially stresses out and presses into the nervous system. And it's like that part of us that is tasked with survival, the animal in us that's unconsciously always scanning the environment for threat. It goes into the dark, and that part of us is not able to do its job. And so because it can't scan the environment, the visual field, and also there are muffled sounds at times. A couple of the caves are in the ground. The other one is made of mud, sand, and straw. And so every once in a while, it's usually completely quiet, but occasionally there might be animals that scurry on the roof. And so in the dark, that part of us that can't fulfill its role of ensuring our survival and our safety, even though we know that we're safe and we're in a room and there's a lock on the door from the other side so people can lock it and they know nothing can come in. But the animal in us is in some level of threat. And what most people's kind of reaction or kind of way of compensating is they go into their mind and they're like, I know that I'm safe. I'm in a room, the door's locked, I'm fine. And whereas that kind of seems like it is logical, but where it seems like a good way to kind of mitigate the fear, it's kind of tends to be more of a way of leaving the body and dissociating and denying the fact that there is actually a threat response, and it doesn't actually resolve it. And we can touch as we get in more of, as we've kind of mapped out some of the fear or stress responses that people go into when they go into the dark, the fight, flight, and freeze, and how that looks in the dark. Since people are very limited in distraction and the coping mechanisms that ones may be used to doing in their life, they're really limited in the dark, but they also can be really hidden and hard to see because they're not so obvious. Um,
You're talking about the coping mechanisms are difficult for an individual to inherently know about themselves, what they are using.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Um, so for example, I'm able to touch on it now. So for example, fight, flight, and freeze and how it looks in the dark. Freeze tends to be in the dark where people don't want to leave the bed. Like the bed is the life raft. And when they gonna get up to go to the bathroom or eat food or take a bath, there's a bathtub in our caves here. There's a sense of uneasiness. Like
mm,
you want to do your thing and then get back to the bed. And the one of the reasons potentially is that the bed, there's like three walls on the bed. And so, like, the animal in us unconsciously, it's like the animal in us feels a little safer to mitigate a threat because it knows nothing can come from the other three sides. It's obviously not a conscious process, but one of the reasons the bed in the kind of corner is going to feel the safest. And we've had people who have been here, myself included, from kind of my historical kind of movement towards freeze in the dark, is that it can feel really, those people can be really relaxed and really still and not even know that they're in freeze. Like there's almost for some, depending on how they orient, almost like mistaking spiritual stillness for dissociation and freeze, and which I historically fall into that category. And so for me, my first few dark retreats, I spent most of my time in the bed, but the way that I kind of made sense of that is that the bed's the most comfortable. It helps disarm me. I really feel relaxed, which was all true. And I certainly at that time wouldn't have said that I was numb or frozen. It was like my mind was still, I was quiet, really relaxed. And one time, maybe it was a year and a half ago, as I heard Adrian sharing with somebody about freeze, and that when they walk around the room, they're a bit uneasy. And it really struck me because there was a couple times where I would feel a little uneasy in the dark, but it was just like, well, of course I'm uneasy. It's dark in here. I want to get back to bed. That's where I feel the safest. I never thought much of it. But as I heard her unpack it a little more, I was like, whoa, that's totally, maybe I am going into a state of freeze and having no idea about it. And to digress for a moment, there was a woman who had come here earlier in the year, and during the check-in, so I'm going up twice a day, morning and evening. And so there's sometimes it might be 10 or 15-minute check-in, and sometimes it might be 45 minutes. It's just kind of meeting people where they're at and kind of just seeing what unfolds. There's no playbook of how it goes. And her voice was really distant. I could tell she was in the bed. I couldn't tell if she was really numb and frozen or if she was really deep. And at the time, Adrian hadn't really mapped out the kind of the stress responses that people were going into and what they looked like. So it was harder at that time to even recognize or to even know that that was happening. And when she came out, she was like, that was so powerful. I had such an amazing time. I was so relaxed and still and quiet. And then she had her outro session with Adrian. And through the process in that session, she realized that she had completely gone numb and frozen in there and had no idea because she was relaxed and at peace. And that mechanism of what we do as an animal unconsciously to insulate ourselves in a sense of safety. And so it's almost like disadvantageous to notice it because then we would feel more overwhelmed, those mechanisms being there to have us feel safe, even though it's not a real safety, but regardless, it feels like it on some level. And so she was able to notice in that session from the process with Adrian that she was closed off from warmth and connection, and then was able to notice what was going on in her body and how she was cold and detached and leaned out of the experience. And then so anyway, later that year when I went in the dark, I was like, I'm not going to stay in the bed this time. I'm going to navigate around the room. And so I was in the chair in the bed. And at that point, I had a lot more somatic awareness. I was more somatically oriented than kind of spiritually oriented, which we'll kind of can unpack a bit. And at one point, I was like, I'm going to sit in the middle of the room is the last place that I want to sit in. Like, and I was like the chair's kind of in the corner, the bat's in the corner. It's a small room, so the corners aren't very far. I was like, I'm going to sit right in the center of the room. And the moment I sat right in the center of the room, my whole entire chest caved in, my heart closed. And like, there was no story of fear, but my body went into a response. And I sat with it for a while. It ended up in that period of sitting there, it didn't resolve, but I could initially see my own mechanisms of wanting to do breath work and meditate and all these things to ultimately cover, control, manage, fix, heal, awaken, whatever the kind of overlay is, ultimately to change what's happening. And that was, for me, really insightful to then also have my own direct experience of kind of the stress response of being in the dark.
So, what would you say that the benefit of someone having a more intimate awareness of their go to stress response, whether it's
Mhm.
fight, flight, freeze, or fawn?
Mhm.
And now that once you kind of realize what that is and that you're in it,
Mm.
what, how do you navigate that in a way that doesn't keep burrowing you down into kind of that fear spiral?
Mhm.
And use that experience, um, as a learning experience.
Yeah, sure. So in that, where the darkness is kind of, for most people, a stressor. And it's a stressor because it's so exposing and there's nothing to hide behind, right? So the darkness could kind of be the journey in there could kind of be seen as twofold. There's the exposing, and then there's the regulating, the being with, the including, the welcoming, the kind of regulating with what's exposed. And so I'll touch on one more, which will kind of highlight that is the flight response, which can be the hardest for someone to see that they're in. I mean, there's the extreme where someone wants to run and they want to leave, kind of a little more obvious of what's happening. But on the other end of the spectrum of the flight response is where somebody is romanticizing their life. And this isn't like, 5-10 minutes of thinking about their life. Like they're ruminating in it for hours of like how great their life is, how much they love their partner and their pet, and they can't wait to get home. And they have all these amazing ideas and creative ideas. And when they get home, they're going to do this, this, and this. And it gets covered in a positive overlay. And it's when it's a whole ruminating process, it's ultimately a dissociative mechanism. That's hard to recognize because it's got this positive thing and it's like really keeping someone feeling safe. And there was a woman I went up some months ago and I went up there and she was like, I'm loving it here. And I'm just also like loving my life. I don't want to leave here, but when I go back, I'm going to do this. And it was like, that was like some of the first things that she had to say. Like it was really moving in her. And after she shared all that and she kind of completed what she was sharing around it, I asked her, what are you noticing in your body? And quickly, as she really started to attune, she quickly saw like, oh, I'm actually feeling anxious and there's a jittery in my chest. Like, well, where do you notice? How do you know you're anxious? She's like, there's a jitteriness in my chest. And then as we went into it, she was like, whoa, like overwhelmed by the sense of the jitteriness. And as we kind of somatically explored that and established safety in her body, she was able to be with that jitteriness and it discharged and resolved. And she was genuinely then able to be in the room and to relax. But like 10 minutes before that, she was just like, my life, there was like a fantasy that she was living in but it was covering an actual uneasiness. And so it was really amazing to just witness how that happened, the stories and the kind of distortions that we all live in that kind of cover the vulnerability and like the basic fragility of, what's underneath it. And so that happens all the time of different ways of which people are constantly reading more between the line, like in the space of what's said, because in many cases, people are either convincing themselves that they're better than they are, or they're doing something that has them disconnecting from how they feel. Now, the benefit is once somebody begins to become aware that they're doing that, and now we break down, this is what fight, flight, and freeze looks like. This is like, this tends to happen in the dark. Feeling afraid is totally normal. Not necessarily expect to, but it is something that likely happens. Now, the spectrum of how that's going to happen in you is going to be different. And so as somebody begins to be able to recognize that, and at times people can, and at other times it's through the support that has somebody being able to see it. Once they see it and they can recognize what they're actually avoiding and resisting in their body, and they're able to be with it, people then start to genuinely relax in their body and be able to include more of themselves. And now it's less about what's happening. It's less about having a peak experience, which the desire for a peak experience tends to be covering some kind of lack or discomfort. Because if there's a genuine connectivity, then there's not as much of a desire to consume. But then that, like, maybe I think how spirituality or Buddhism maybe gets distorted is now it's like, I shouldn't consume, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that. But then it's just like another form of control. But when it actually moves from the inside out, like those people, when they really drop in the dark, they don't have much of a desire for anything. But it's not because they're replicating or performing some spiritual idea that they shouldn't have a desire for something. It's arising out of a depth of connection. But that there's a membrane that people have to pass through because it's not all good and gravy. And so there is levels of overwhelm and discomfort that people move into. And once someone genuinely stops avoiding and resisting what's happening, then the darkness actually becomes this safe, inviting space where they have permission to be in what they're in. And then through that, which has been totally amazing to witness, is just somebody genuinely feeling safe in their body. They open to just like so many deeper levels in them. And we've had so many people come here who are like, I don't even like meditating. I don't meditate, never did plant medicine, don't know about anything spiritually, not interested in spirituality. And they're open and they're receptive and they really come along with us on this somatic exploration, and they're willing and they're able to be honest with what's in their body and not try to have a certain kind of experience. And as they drop and they really connect in their body, these people, some of them, and not that this is the goal, but it's kind of a byproduct for some, is they can drop into hours of stillness. And some of them, like, you realize some people meditate 25, 30 years, and they're lucky if they get 20 seconds or a minute of stillness. And these people are in hours of stillness without any meditation. There's no movement to control. It was a movement to connect. And that really began to shift for me kind of my lens on spirituality, and seeing that there was people who have a lot of spirituality and a lot of meditation practice. It didn't necessarily prepare them for the dark. In many cases, it actually not in all cases, but in many cases, it created more of a barrier. It was another level of a persona. It was this pursuit of having a certain kind of experience that was having them unconsciously resist what was really happening. And so that's been, yeah, fascinating to witness.
As you're talking, it reminds me of a small death of the architecture of the mind, because there is a inherent hardwired system in our body that is fight or flight. I mean, there's a reason it's there and it's very good at what it does.
Mhm.
But we identify, I think it's an opportunity to recognize that we identify with that aspect of ourselves and all the constructs around that. And that becomes part of the identity of who I am. And that mini death of not pushing that away, but recognizing it for what it is, and then falling into the body. And I love how you mentioned using the body as an anchor.
Mm.
And what I know from my own work is that the body is also deeply connected with the subconscious. So being able to connect with the wisdom of the body that it's holding and the map that it's providing, that you have like the master key for yourself, and being able
Mhm.
to go inside and using what I've heard you say is emotion, is there's that sense of vulnerability and surrender and control, and using not just the body, but also maybe the emotion to unveil the inner roadmap or experience of
Mhm.
somebody.
Yeah. 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 What the In using the body as an anchor, that is one thing that we really lean in with people of different somatic grounding practices in the body to really attune to the location in the room. What does it feel like to like where your body meets the room? And like such basic, fundamental, really simple, so boring and non-spiritual orientations and connections points have people dropping into the most profound revelations and fundamental shifts. And it's something that a lot of people have shared is like, wow, it's so simple. There's no flashing lights. There's no like interstellar activity. It's like, well, I'm just feeling what it feels like to feel supported by the bed. And then all of a sudden, there's like a felt sense of safety. And all of a sudden, like the body opens and the mind quiets. And then this person's like, whoa, like, there's a tenderness that starts to emerge. And there's just a journey, an arc in that. And people are like, I can't believe how simple it is. But the shift in orientation, the knowing and the insights that happen are at such a fundamental level that it changes everything. And that journey in the darkness is more of a journey of subtraction as opposed to addition, right? It's not about having a peak experience or something like anything like that. And maybe now's like a nice moment to address, I think, some of the ways that the darkness retreat has been talked about in the past is this glorified DMT sensationalized spiritual experience, um, which it's just not. It can be for a very few people have like cool visions, but everyone who has had those, who has come here, kind of wants them to go away after 5, 10 minutes. Like the simplicity of the dark that like invites somebody into the subtlety and the tenderness and the depth of their being, those lights draw them out. The big experiences draw them out of this tenderness that they begin to uncover. And for most people, there's not flashing lights and a big DMT boom or whatever it is. It's really the simplicity in that. And when somebody comes grasping for that big experience, some people, when there is like the sincerity and the humility, they're able to begin to feel in their body that the movement for that is because there's some lack that is triggering and stimulating that they're not really able to make contact with. But through being in the dark, through with experienced support, someone asking the questions and attuning with people, they can begin to be like, oh, yeah, there is like, this is what I'm feeling. I want this because it's ultimately going to cover this. And, boredom is an interesting exploration in the dark. Um, it tends to be, there are some people where they're just like, I'm bored, and boredom in the dark tends to go hand in hand with numbness. And there is like where somebody is dissociated to the point where they have no feeling. There's just nothing happening in their body. And I had a friend and she was just going to do 24 hours in the dark. And she went in the morning. And in the evening, I went up to just touch in and see how she was doing. And she's just like, I think I'm done. It's kind of boring. Nothing's happening. I think it's just it's kind of dumb. And I was like, well, what does boredom feel like? Like, how do you know you're bored? And there's this exploration of boredom. And within like a minute, she was sobbing. First, there was fear. Then there was relief and sobbing. And like she was through the co-regulation, she then felt safe enough with also the kind of invitation to like, what does that feel like? Then all of a sudden, so many feelings came online. And it was like, there was a lot happening. She was certainly not bored. And at that point, but amazing the body's mechanism. Like before that, there was just nothing happening. And so, things like that happen all the time. And it lends itself to how important having quality experienced support is. And that's, when you touched on in the beginning, the difference between us and maybe other centers or like what's emerging in the darkness retreat world is I think it's essential that there's a somatic practitioner or somatic therapist on board on the staff, whether they're part of doing the check-ins or they're part of like before and after support, or they're just there in case they're needed. Like they're also there maybe overseeing the support. Because there's so much that goes unseen and it is a really stimulating experience. And so somebody who's well versed in the nervous system and in working with people in that it's really essential. Otherwise, I feel like most people will, and we've witnessed it in the earlier days and we still see it now occasionally when somebody comes and they pretty much got it figured out and they're just like, or their mechanisms are so well tight and well held that there's not that much receptivity that they go into some kind of coping strategy and mechanism and they may not even realize it, but you could feel the level of stimulation compared to when somebody is either genuinely regulated or just genuinely available and dysregulated. Because if somebody's available and dysregulated, when there's the opportunity to co-regulate, that person is going to co-regulate and they're going to settle and there's going to be a sense of connection. And something, one more thing to touch kind of on that is that this was kind of a point of through the evolution of being with people and really something we didn't really touch into until the last year. And it's still something we're unpacking and exploring of the best way or the most impactful way to really communicate it is there's this quality of endurance that happens in the dark. Like people are imagining they're coming for this really difficult experience. It is really difficult and challenging, but enduring it is just not going to do anything for you except really increase your coping mechanisms and strategies, which are really great for achieving and, succeeding in the world in a worldly sense, but it's not really going to do much for dropping into the tenderness and the depth. And so we really tried to bring a sense where somebody can feel and understand in their body the difference between enduring and like being with. And what happens in the dark is 95% of people might as well be locked in there, like the door padlocked, like, because to them, in their mind, there's no way in hell that they're leaving the dark. The door might as well be locked because they've committed to doing it. They've told people, they've told themselves, I'm going to do this. Like most people, when they come here, they imagine, because they're coming to go in the dark, they imagine that they're going and they're not going to leave the room. Like there's not even an option to leave the room in their mind. And what we've seen is there's so much shame that keep people locked in the dark. Like they actually feel trapped in there. That's not really their conscious process, but there's a sense of somebody feeling trapped. And then so now add on to that when there's a fear response or a stress response or just something, some level of even low grade agitation, and they unconsciously feel trapped in there that they can't leave. It really makes it even bigger and more difficult to regulate and be with it. So something that we've been exploring is like really stripping the shame off the front end when people arrive and really being like, it's not about staying in the dark for 3 to 4, 5 days. We've had people here in the early days for 20 days, 25 days, 30 days, 40 days. And I wouldn't say those people had any deeper of an experience of anyone else. I'd say probably on the opposite end. But that was in the earlier days with less support too. But because of what happens when people typically go on longer, it's going to be different for everyone. Everyone has their sweet spot. Is that there's a sense of enduring that really comes online. It is really challenging to have that level of solitude and to genuinely feel relaxed when you have that many days. And so I've heard from many people, like I did 9 days or 10 days, and it's so important because it wasn't until the last day that this happened and this happened. And it's like, probably because you started relaxing because it was almost over. And then you opened and things could actually happen. But before that, you're doing so many different things to keep yourself tight in there, to protect yourself from what was really happening. And so when we really strip the shame and we encourage people, like, turn on the light a candle, come outside for 1 minute, 10 minutes, just experience, what that does in your body. Then when this sense of not being trapped in the dark, like it becomes even more of like, I want to be here, which brings, more of an ability for someone to navigate in their body. And for many people, they then don't even need to turn on the light or come out of the dark because they know they have permission. They know that they can, and that relaxes them more. And then they're able to be with more of what they have, a bigger capacity because they know they can leave. And so sometimes just that brings people a bigger capacity for being with the waves that move through them in the dark.
That's a really interesting insight of the possibility that it was just because they gave them self permission to relax because it was almost over, that bracing for so long was just a holding pattern.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard it from many people who have, in the earlier days when they'd gone to other places and like reading reports, and it was like, it was the last day. Like it was always really important to do this many because it was the last day that something happened. And in the people who are seeking for a glorified DMT experience, there are no number of days that elicit that response. We've had people here for, up to 40 days and not have really much of a visual sensational experience, and people who on the first or second day have pretty profound visuals. And so really the length of time, it's really the depth of opening, which shorter periods of time in the dark, we found 3 days to really be a sweet spot as it gives people time to sleep in the beginning. It does take time to get familiar and really relax and then open in the space. And so shorter can actually elicit a deeper experience because there's not as much overwhelm in like, I have to be with this for so long. It's like, oh, I can leave if I want, and it's not too long. And so once it's all in the relaxation and really being with.
Your perspective, what do you think the number one thing is that people, just humans in general, that this is highlighting, um, s- are so adamant about not feeling or not going inside? What is
Mm,
the biggest barrier that the average person that's either listening to this or watching this can maybe relate to? Because I think we all have some sort of an experience of feeling this thing inside and avoiding it, like consciously know you're avoiding it, right? And the darkness retreat is just highlighting the beautiful journey of going inside and being able to to sit with that inside. So what is it about inner experience that people avoid with such fervence?
hmm I mean, I think a few things. One is permission, like unconsciously, the lack of permission. Um, Not to go on too big of a tangent, so I'll stick with it. But on one little tangent is like fear. In our culture, it's really not appropriate for a man to express fear.
Mm.
And for the most part, and, sadness can also be in there. Anger's great. Anger for a man is like powerful and like, it can be more of a thing, but like fear. And so when it arises, there's almost like it doesn't even have space. It's like almost before it's even felt. I mean, it might not even be consciously felt, which we notice in the dark a lot is like, it's not like somebody's lying and being like, I'm scared and I'm having a hard time. They're like, it's great and I'm peaceful. And it's just like something's not, they're not lying. And then they could be saying that and then we'll land in a somatic journey and they're like, whoa, my whole body just relaxed. And whoa, I was feeling anxious. I had no idea I was feeling anxious. And so that happens all the time. And it's not like, so that person wasn't lying. There's just a complete barrier to actually feeling it. And I think one of it is permission. There's not permission to feel certain things from how we grew up, from our peers, from our culture through our spiritual lens. Certainly a spiritual man is not going to feel fear. I mean, that's just like, you're doing something wrong. And so because of that, there's not an availability to feel that. And I think with both being in the dark, having quality experienced support that's able to notice and ask questions that like one may begin to be able to feel it. Like that's the exposure and then noticing it. And then the other part is regulating in with it, which I think becomes a little bit, it's definitely easier in the dark, the co-regulating, because you so want to feel safe. And there's this opportunity to, there's no culture or reflection from someone else. You can't see someone else reacting to how you feel. So like the darkness does offer this immense permission. And that then has people relaxing into more of what they are. Now, this is another piece where spirituality distorts, in my experience, distorts and creates less permission is for the in many cases, if somebody's orienting spiritually, they're looking for in their mind they have this idealized, romanticized sense of spirituality, a spiritual experience, what a spiritual person is like. And there's this moving towards a certain kind of spiritual experience. There's doing these practices to get yourself into some altered state to have a certain kind of experience. And so that in and of itself kind of cuts one off from what's actually happening. Are you bored? Is there lack? Is there, like what's going on that there's a movement towards that? And that not to discount spiritual practice. There's just kind of like this exploration of where is it moving from? Is it a genuine movement to more intimately connect with what's here right now? Or is the movement to have a different kind of experience? Because right here and right now is mundane and boring. And so I think that is another thing that creates less permission. I know it has in myself and witnessing it in different people who come and there's many people who come here who are like, whoa, I didn't realize I needed permission to feel this way. And not like it was even permission from me. I mean, there is that invitation, but it's like the dark is just like, you're not referencing your sense of worth and sense of self based on the validation and the reflection of others. So it's almost like, whoa, what if it was okay to feel this way? And so that being one, kind of the lack of permission. And I think there is a genuine sense of overwhelm, like a legitimate where someone's at, not that someone has an inability, but like just where they're organized in their system with what's going on, that there is some level of that they're actually not able. There's not a capacity to actually be with it. And like that does happen. There are people who come here who and we've also gotten really a lot better at recognizing it right when someone comes where it's like, whoa, let's customize this retreat with this person. Them going into the dark for 3 days, like they might be able to and totally endure it, but they're totally gonna like go numb or dissociate or just be super dysregulated. And there was somebody who came a few weeks ago and she went in the dark for 2 hours and she was like, no fucking way, I can't be in there, like super freaked out. And so we really invited her to customize it. Like, what if you just wove in and out? There's no right way to do it. The more that you make it your own, one of the invitations here is to let nurture lead. What would nurture do? And so this invitation of like, what would nurture? It's not about enduring. You're not going to get any bonus points for finishing this. I mean, maybe on some level and some cognitive level, but there's nothing that's going to happen in your body that has you drop into a deeper connection because you did it. And so she wove in and out of the dark and she had some more one-on-one time with Adrian and we had deeper, longer talks while I was up there. And she did that for 4 days. And on the 5th day that she was here, the final day, she was in the dark and I went up that evening and she was like, Scott, I love being in my body. I'm so happy in the dark. And that was somebody who went in for 2 hours and like ran out screaming and was like, I can't handle it. And she was like, there's still these waves, but they don't overwhelm me now. Like I can be with the sense of overwhelm in my body. I can be with that now. Her capacity to be with her sense of like safety in her body grew in those 4 or 5 days. And so that being another, that there is a genuine like capacity from being whatever it is, the feelings in the body being too much to feel. So there's a real meeting people where they're at. Like for her, weaving in and out of the dark was like the most profound thing ever. For some people, stepping out of the dark is the most profound thing ever, where they lean into this sense of nurture over enduring. And then all of a sudden, there's just like a deeper level of honesty of what the body really wants to do and not this spiritual warrior that just can plow through it and ultimately kind of push down and disconnect from what's really underneath that movement to be strong is this movement, is this thing of feeling threatened.
I love that you guys have been open to the evolution as you've gone through over the last 4.5 years and learning to meet people where they're at. That's such a beauty instead of it being such a structured expectation that then they take on as that expectation. With that in mind, would you be able to dive into a little bit of maybe what some of your preparatory and integration preparatory ahead of time? Like if someone was knew they were coming in a month, is there anything that you encourage people to do ahead of time? Is there anything that happens before they get into the darkness aspect? And then the integration part before they get on plane and head home.
Yeah. So Adrian's in the process of kind of fleshing out a preparatory course that would really somatically orient people. It would touch on expectations. That's another, like, just journaling about expectations. Like, why am I coming and what do I expect? Some people are forthcoming and like, I'm expecting this, this, and this. And then there's a lot of people who come who are like, I have no expectations, which, like, to them, they're being honest. When they get in there, all of a sudden they realize they have expectations. They don't expect it to be difficult. They don't expect to be sad or angry or scared. And, that then, because there are these hidden expectations, there's almost then a resistance to, what's really happening. And so really exploring expectations would be a thing. There's a book that we really encourage people read before they come. It's called It's Not Always Depression. And it's a somatic based model called AEDP, which is weaves in like the core emotions into a somatic orientation, and also kind of unpacks how we tend to use anxiety, guilt, and shame as a way of covering our core emotions. And we're certainly a culture of anxiety and shame. And that really gets exposed in there. Like we talked about the shame of leaving, or the shame of not having a peak experience, or the anxiety that's driving whatever it may be. And so that's one thing, reading that book, exploring expectations, um, getting familiar with somatic therapy, getting familiar with a somatic process, there's no level of meditation practice that we've seen that prepares somebody as not all, most meditation, and not that there's anything wrong with it, but most meditation is a form of control. There's a part of you controlling the other part of you. And so there's some level of how long can somebody control themselves for? So somebody could go in the dark and they may be able to meditate 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. They sleep for 6 hours, 8 hours. There's a period where they're kind of then exposed and not able to control. And that's really when there's this invitation of seeing what's underneath. Before I went into my first dark retreat, I had spent 2.5 years in solitude over the course of 8 or 10 years, mostly in southern Baja. And I was very familiar with solitude. I'd sit in the same spot on this rock and meditate for 8, 10, 12 hours a day and fast. And right before my first dark retreat, I had spent 40 days up in the mountains alone meditating. And I went into the dark retreat definitely with a spiritual ego and like, this is going to be great. No senses that it was going to be difficult at all. And I totally got humbled and floored. Like, I could not believe how difficult it was. And like solitude and meditation were a joy. And I could feel in there how it didn't feel natural. Like I could feel the way in which it was me controlling. And I couldn't control what was happening in there because there's so much that comes up. Some people have really amazing evolved mechanisms of control and coping. And so those people tend to be more on the numb spectrum when they go in the dark. And so there's not much firing in their system that they don't notice it much. I have tended historically more in the numb. And so I was able to really hold out in the dark, relaxed for a while, but there wasn't much, moving in my body. Anyway, in that time, I was so floored by how my meditation and time in solitude didn't prepare me at all. I was like, there's something missing here. And then witnessing people who have come here who have no meditation, no solitude experience, and they're just like the depth they drop into. And I'm in the early days, it's just like my jaw would drop of just like, wow, like there's how natural spirituality is. The depths and the deeper levels of us are like not something new. It's just like an attuning to what's here, deeper and deeper levels of subtlety and tenderness. And that movement to grab at and have a certain kind of experience, ultimately is covering. And this Pema Chodron quote where she says, "We awaken to the tenderness of life when we stop shielding ourselves from the vulnerability of our conditioning and the basic fragility of existence." And that can be scary. And it's a lot easier to like buck up and be strong and, cover whatever it is. And so this invitation of what happens when we let nurture lead, like what happens when we attune to that feeling of being held by the bed, what happens when we lean into what is most tender within. And so that was a big tangent from how to prepare. But one of the others is just the simplicity of laying down, and whether it's outside, in the bed, on the floor, and just feeling in your body what it feels like to be held, what it feels like to feel supported, and just beginning to get familiar with being in your body and just being with, not controlling, not really regulating the breath, just being with what's here. And then on the flip side, you asked about the integration. And so, in short, somebody arrives in the afternoon, they just get familiar in the space, they go into the dark that night, and then they come out that next day and they have this 2-hour somatic-based session with Adrian. So they get familiar, they're in the dark, they're in there for 18, 20 hours, whatever it is. And then they have the session with Adrian. And then that night they go in. They have typically 3 days, 4 nights in the dark. Then they emerge in the morning, and then they have another session with Adrian. And that session really gives them the opportunity to process some of the undigested stuff that came up in the dark that they weren't able to be with and regulate, and also deepen into what they came to know, these new ways of orienting, these new ways of being with. Like, since it wasn't about this peak grand experience or any specific experience, it was more about like a fundamental shift in how we oriented to all of it. And so, in the integration, one thing that many people get concerned about and scared about is just like, they're like, am I going to lose this? Like, what I've touched, is it going to go away? And Adrian's always very blunt. Even before people ask that, she's just like, this will go away. You are not going to carry this with you. Like, it is, even though it's not about an experience, you have also come into a certain kind of experience, but since it's been so slow and steady and wasn't something huge, but you are altered, and it's going to go away. And if you hold yourself to this standard that this is how you should be, then again, you have another overlay over not honestly just being with where you're at and wanting to replicate and perform a certain kind of state, or to perform what you know, but it's not really naturally arising from the inside out. So there's this invitation to really lean into that fundamental knowing that what had somebody come into it was just beginning to be with what's here. And so one of the other things we do in the integration side is every 6 weeks, we have a group Zoom call. All the past dark retreatants are invited. Adrian leads the call, and it's an hour and a half. She kind of opens with a somatic meditation, exploration, and then we open it up for other people to share. And so other people are witnessing everybody who's just like, whoa, there's this sense of like failing, or I got home a few weeks ago and it's like, but then everybody being held in like returning back to what they knew. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, that sense of failure was how I was feeling when I was in the dark. And so returning back to that sense of just simply being with.
Hmm.
One thing that we kind of I didn't circle back to was just the history of, of dark retreats, and maybe to just touch on that quickly is the if we start way far back, we can go into where people going into caves, like there's the Kogis in Colombia. Um, the Kogis in Colombia at birth, however, through their process, they're chosen. They go in with the elder medicine men, the Kogi mamas, and their birth mom, and they go into the dark at birth. My understanding is they're in there for 7 to 9 years in total darkness. My understanding is, though, that at times they do come outside to see the moon and the stars, but the majority of that is spent in the dark. There's the Greeks with the catacombs. The Egyptians had the pyramids. All throughout India and Tibet and China, there's different lineages that went into the dark. I recently learned about the indigenous in Australia, and that they had a dark retreat practice going into caves. And so there has been, their practice was more, it wasn't for like the medicine men and the shaman, it was for the everyday person that was part of that culture. Like when they reached a point of disconnection, they went with their medicine man and they were brought into the caves, and they had a whole practice with that. And then fast forward to our more modern times, there was somebody who did a study, I forget his name, in British Columbia in the 60s for like 30 or 40 years. And he did a study on sensory deprivation and bringing people into the dark. They called them like the rest chambers. It was an acronym. And from that, it really excited some different researchers and therapists, and then it really took off in the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic has more dark retreats than any other country in the world, and it's a small country there. They have 30 plus dark retreats in the Czech. And so there's Montauk Chi in Thailand who started doing dark retreat practices a long time ago. And so it's really become a more modern, slowly, kind of modern movement of Montauk Chia has more of a spirituality kind of take on it. And I think there's other places where it's more rooted in a somatic kind of therapy, wellness, as opposed to like a spiritual achieving experience.
As an add-on modality for that personal growth and or development transformation process.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that transformation, there's a woman who came here once, and she's she's a transformational leader in the transformational field. And while she was in there, one of the questions I was like, hey, what if you didn't need to transform? Like, what if we just like tabled transformation for the day? Like, what would happen? And she's just like, whoa, I just like my whole body just relaxed. And then she went into a really, like the rest of her time in there, that was in the beginning, was an amazing somatic exploration with like all the waves from grief and sadness and anger and joy, like all the emotions, like the full spectrum. Like it was a really humbling experience to witness what happens when there's just a genuine meeting in the body and there's really the full permission, and someone genuinely feels safe so that they're able to really be with, what's moving through.
Mm-mm. Scott, thank you so much for everything and that you guys do down there and down there, well, in Oregon.
Down there from
Uh,
Alaska.
yeah, from Alaska, it is down there for me.
Mm.
Um, it's and I'm just Thank you for listening to those individuals, those hundreds of individuals that have come through, and also your own inner wisdom on the evolution of what you guys have been doing. And I really look forward to see where it goes for you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca.
In in closing, I'm I'd love for you to just tap in yourself, and for that person that's listening or watching right now and they've made it this far and they've gotten goosebumps many different times and it just really resonates with them. Is there anything that comes through for you as a message for them?
Yeah, I mean, you had asked one of the things of like preparing and one thing to explore. And at times it's when appropriate, something we'll explore when someone's in the dark is this real unpacking of like, what is the most important thing? Like, what matters most? And then really getting clear, really getting honest, what is that? And then like distilling it down, like, why? Like, what happens in your body when you have that most important thing, that most meaningful experience, whatever it is, and beginning to get familiar with what that most important feeling is.
Mm.
And then what happens when we really lean into that thing that connects us with that most important feeling, as it's not something outside of us that's really creating it. That feeling lives within us. And so to really get honest with what matters most.
Mm, thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
Hmm.
And again, welcome to Season 3. It would mean a lot if you leave a review, share on your social media, or with someone you know would benefit from hearing or watching this. It helps to bring this content out to the people that need to hear it the most. And as Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home. Until we meet again, my friends, be well.